Hello, my name is Ben Holland, and I work as Director of Business Development and Operations Analysis at Cactus Feeders out of our office in Amarillo. I'm pleased to be part of this symposium, but despite having grown up in the Northwest Texas Panhandle and spending a fair amount of time on irrigated wheat fields, I was usually the one horseback, ducking sprinklers, checking cattle, and not thinking much about irrigation operation, water requirements, pressure, or wells. I was not in my department, as the saying goes. My education and experience instead have been primarily in ruminant nutrition, specifically feedlot cattle. And thus far, I've spent a lot of time doing research in animal nutrition and health management. So only recently has this topic become a focus of mine. And so I'll ask your forgiveness for not using the right terminology at times and maybe overlooking something obvious. I'll also ask that you help us out and correct me if needed. We're learning every day, and we've got a lot to learn. But that's really what TAWC is about, sharing ideas to help each other make the best decisions in regard to our most important resource. So when I think about that title, adding sustainable cattle production to your rotation, I really struggled with it. And I wonder, do we really have the data necessary to explain how to add sustainable cattle production into the rotation? And the answer to that is really probably not yet. So instead, I want to look at the road that we see ourselves on and use that title as a goal potentially for the future, for the acres that we farm, and potentially the region in which we live. So for the rest of the time, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think it's a worthwhile goal to add sustainable cattle to the rotation. Talk about some general principles and observations that we follow and we've learned, and ask a few questions about what has yet to be answered. And so I can only start from where we sit in Cactus Feeders and talk a little bit about us and our view of the world. We have 10 feed yards in the Panhandle in Southwest Kansas, where at any given time we've got about 550,000 head of cattle on feed. We participate in the beef industry, in the cattle industry, which takes plant products, some of them, many of them worthless to human nutrition, and cattle that are born across the entire country, from deserts to swamps to mountains to nice pastures, and convert all of those into beef. In our production cycle, we're always thinking about improving how we contribute to that effort and how we meet our mission, which is feeding a hungry world, families, friends, and neighbors. So when we discuss sustainability, we consider the three pillars, not only environmental, but also economic and societal. When you look at where our locations are in West Texas and Southwest Kansas, and you can lay on that map of the Ogallala Aquifer, this one came from Dienes and others 2020, projecting a depletion time frame from relatively soon in the dark red to much further away in the yellow. And you can see that most of these feed yards are located right in the middle of the red or the black, which would indicate some depletion. Quite a bit of depletion has already happened. So we have to think about our region, about water use in our region, and sustainability of our business in that region. To look at a couple, or at least one more map from that same publication, again next to the aquifer map. Now they've got counties and are projecting a percent of current irrigation farming that might be lost to pasture. And when they talk about pasture, they're talking about back to native grass or dryland grass pasture. And you can see a couple of the counties where we operate in Southwest Kansas, here in Sherman County, our neighbors in Dallam and Hartley County, and even the Southwest Plains, where projected as much as 20 to 25% of irrigated acres might be lost to pasture. But we would say, and ask the question about all of these forecasts, usually the worst sometimes doesn't come to pass, and there are increments between whatever a current state is and whatever the future state might be. And we need to ask, what would those increments be, and what would pasture look like between now and then, and what might we make pasture if we can use some of our ability to irrigate in the meantime. Because our region has a rich history from pioneers and cowboys to to farming. We've made a lot of mistakes in the meantime, but out of those mistakes, we've developed technologies and practices that have helped us become a very productive and a region that continues to grow in a lot of cases, and very resilient to the conditions and the harsh environment in which we find themselves. So our goal is to think about how we can implement grazing using irrigation in maybe long rotations as a way to continue that history of development and innovation and learning that helped us to get where we are today. And so as a case study, let's think a little bit about Cactus Feed Yard, located in North Amarillo at Cactus, Texas, and the farm that surrounds that, which is one of the larger farms associated with our feed yards, about 2,200 irrigated acres around a 75,000 head feed yard. And you think about what might we do with those acres to support our core business, which is feeding cattle. So in a 75,000 head feed yard, we'll make nearly 2 million pounds of feed a day, and about 60% of that dry matter basis would be corn. So that, do some math around that, and we might feed about 21,000 bushels of corn per day. And across an entire year, that's a lot of corn. At 220 bushels an acre in our region, that might be 36,000 acres of corn to meet our total requirements. And we know that you can't, we don't have the water in many places to grow all acres on corn every year now. So it's probably more like 50 to 70,000 plus acres. And so when you think about what might be done to contribute to that corn need, giving 2,200 acres, you know, maybe we could grow 6 to 10 days worth. And we're not corn farmers. There are people in our region and another region that are very good corn farmers and have a emphasis in that. And luckily, we've got an infrastructure that can get the product from where it's produced well to where it is fed well. The other thing that we need on a regular basis, and quite a lot of, are cattle. And so in a feed yard of that size, we would need on average about 2,800 cattle per week. Population would turn about twice in a year. And so in each week in a steady state, we might ship and receive 2,800 cattle per week. And that's something where our expertise can help us. And maybe that's a better use of our irrigated acres to help supply and meet that need than it would be to meet the need of feed. And so when we think about that need, we think about converting those acres which were row crop into pasture, and we think about what might be done with grazing. We ask ourselves, what if the decisions we make could improve soil water infiltration rate? There's a variety of research out there that suggests that different practices can improve the stability of soil aggregates, and thus the amount of water that goes into the soil and the rate at which it can go into the soil before it evaporates from the surface. Could it influence the organic matter in the soil if we're able to do that? Other research, a lot of topic of conversation is about storing carbon out of the atmosphere into grazing lands. Well, what is carbon out of atmosphere into grazing land? That is soil organic matter. And can we increase that, and how much can we increase that? If we can increase it, can it improve the water holding capacity of the soil? Some other data suggests that each 1 percentage point of soil organic matter can hold an additional 20 to 30,000 gallons of soil per acre. And do that math, and that's somewhere around 3/4 to close to an inch of moisture retained in the soil associated with that organic matter. So those are the things can we do, and how do we get there? So some of the principles that are driving our decisions have to help us meet those objectives that we just talked about, and the practical objectives that we're trying to meet from an economic standpoint. Improve the flow of cattle into the feed yards. We live in a region where we have tremendous production of cattle on winter wheat, but those cattle come in large numbers in relatively few times. So they come a lot in March when we have to get off to harvest a grain crop, and they come from graze out in May and maybe even into early June. But then after June 1st, there's really not a lot of cattle movement until grass cattle start moving and calves start moving in the fall. So how can our grazing program improve the flow of cattle into the feed yards? And some of that is becoming a little counter seasonal to the existing supply that's out there. Secondly, we need to balance growth rate of both the cattle and the plants and head count. Again, we have an objective to have as many animals coming in as possible. So heavy stocking rates and more turns would suggest that we should be using lighter weight cattle and having more of them on the same number of acres and turning those acres more times. So that's what's part of our objective in forage selection and growth. Sometimes we might harvest a forage crop. We do certainly have a need for silage and hay in our feed yards, and we might do that, but probably not every time. And we've gained a lot of information that can drive some principles and how to manage that from several places, and we keep learning every day and trying it ourselves and attempting to develop a system that is repeatable for us. One of those principles is to always have cover. Some research out of Kansas State University suggests that evaporation from bare soil itself can be 30% of total evapotranspiration, and that residue cover on farmland, this is for wheat or corn, can result in 2.5 to 3.5 inches of water saving. So even in our grazing scenario, we need to think about how we can have cover on the soil as much as possible to reduce that evaporation, and have a residue for when we are through with an annual crop, for instance. You know, all those of us in the cattle forage production, we always have this balance and this fear of wasting grass. We have inputs that went into producing forage. If we don't put that forage into an animal, is it wasted? Well, really that cover has to come from growing plants, the shade of growing plants, or from residue, and both would be non-existent if we graze to the ground. And so here's an example on the right, a picture we took or dug a spade of soil out from under some pretty decent residue from grazing a summer crop of sorghum and millet, compared to a chunk of soil that came from not too far away in an area that didn't have good cover on it. And you see visually that this soil is more moist, so it's retained a little bit more moisture. It has probably more stable aggregates that will allow future moisture events to better infiltrate into that soil than does this clump here. And that'd be more representative of something that looks a little bit like this, where we grazed very close to the ground in the early summer of this year. We have a wheat planted on this, or triticale now, but you can see how this surface is pretty sealed, and we're going to have a lot of evaporation, as we likely have here where the sprinkler is running, and we've got a fair amount of our water running down the hill and quite a bit likely being evaporated. So how much improvement in water, both holding and infiltration, can we have with more cover and less loss to evaporation in an area where we have 90 to 100 plus inches of pan evaporation a year? Always have living roots. You have to ask yourself, where does the material come from that is going to provide forage for the animals to eat? What's going to provide cover that we just talked about, that's going to drive the improvement in organic matter into the soil? All of those come from growing plants. Plants harvesting CO2 from the atmosphere and supported by a microbiome in the soil. So we hope and try to prevent disruptions to the process of growing, of having growing roots and living roots in the soil as possible. Even dormant may not be a lot of rapid growth, but that is living, and we need to maintain that. So here's an example of a general rotation that we're trying to get into with our forage crops, where we have about 1/3 of the acres, 30% to 1/3 in a perennial. And we'll talk about some of what we hope that provides in grazing here in a little bit. 1/3 would go into a summer annual early, so June, and then we'd expect to graze that from June 15th or June 20th until freeze, or until the crop runs out. And after that, we would plant a late crop of triticale that's likely not to be grazed until the spring, And then on the other third, early crop of wheat or triticale planted in August. Okay, we're talking about the northern Texas Panhandle, grazed from October heavily, intensively until December, and then we would come off of that generally through the dormant period in the winter, and then back on it again for 100 to 110 days in the spring. And so then that early trick crop becomes the summer, followed by late trick, and the summer and late trick becomes the early triticale in year 2. And so if you look at that, so here we have our summer followed by late triticale, then the early triticale and the perennial. A couple things we know that the times at which we don't have a growing crop are minimized, and so that's represented by the black. From a grazing standpoint, the perennial provides some grazing ability in those seasons in which we don't have the annual available. When we're trying to start the summer crop, or when we run out of the winter crop in the beyond May 1st into early June, and then in the early fall, in early September and October, when we don't have a lot of grazing available, we try to have the annual. And there may well be a place for some warm seasons to kind of cover these areas we're expecting not to get a lot of growth through the heat of the summer, but that's yet to be explored by us. But I will say that as we do all of that and we think about moving those cattle and targeting the growth that we'd like to have, the timing is really not easy. So look at this particular field where these calves are. And it looks like there's a lot of plant material there, and there is a lot of plant material. But I will say that if you look closely at all of those plants, that the ends of those leaves have already been consumed. So what's left is the material that is closer to the stem. The stem itself, certainly a lot more structural. It's going to have a lot more fiber, going to be less digestible and less useful for our animals. In the feed yard, we can match animal growth expectations with the nutrients that we provide, because we do that, we deliver it to them. And we think, and we should be able in some of these rapid growing, especially these annuals, is to match the cattle to material that is really rapidly growing and is highly digestible. So we maximize the energy intake from what we allow our animals to graze at a given time. And so, but I will say that the timing is not easy, and we've still got to work on that. We've got to work on the system of how to recognize when we need to move the cattle, when we need to stock the forages, when we need to remove them, what is appropriate amount of residue to remain. And it's not unlike building the system that we have in the feed yards, where we can get 75,000 head of cattle fed in 6.5 or 7 hours in a given day very efficiently with less than 50 employees. We've got to build that same type of system to manage large numbers outside and meet all of the expectations that we're trying to hit. So as I wrap up, I want to think back to our goals: improving water infiltration, increasing organic matter, pushing to a point where we don't need as much supplemental water to meet a production expectation. And that causes us to ask a few questions. How much can organic matter really be increased, and how fast can it happen? We've collected samples from several of these fields, and maybe we have a third, a half a point organic matter gain in a field that spent most time in the program. But that's well within the overall range from all the fields of 1.5 to 3.4%. And it may be in the inherent variation of taking that measurement. So how long will it take to make that clear trend, and what's the maximum? In a future state, what can be done with 5 inches of supplemental irrigation, or 6 or 7, compared to today, we're likely putting 15 to 20 on many of these acres across an entire year, which is outside of a summer growing season. But what can be done with less in the future? If we're able to drive that organic matter like we think, then maybe quite a bit. And then finally, where does a rotation, a multi-year rotation with a row crop look? Where does that fit into this scenario? Rick has shared some budgets with me on alternate year cotton, where you can think about concentrating inputs on 50% of the acres to provide similar returns to to irrigating the full 100. So what would that multi-year rotation look like, where we could take advantage of market situations where they might exist and build on the improvements in productivity that the grazing system might provide. So to close, I'd like to thank Rick for inviting me to present, and TAWC. I'd like to thank TAWC for inviting me to present and being an excellent resource for us and the area as we go down this road. Rick and Phil and Dr. West have been very helpful, so I'd like to thank them. And I've got my contact information here. Please contact us. We'd like to keep learning new ideas on this topic and new innovations and help others in this progression as well. Thank you.